Germany is not what Germans call their country. In fact, the real name might surprise you, and it all started with a Roman misunderstanding. This simple fact opens up a fascinating historical puzzle, one that stretches back over 2 millennia. It's a story of empires, tribes, languages, and the slow, often messy, formation of a nation. Why does such a prominent European country have so many different names across the world? The English say Germany, the French say Allemagne, the Finns say Saksa, and the Germans themselves say Deutschland. Each name is a clue, a breadcrumb leading back to a different point in history, a different group of people, and a different perspective on the lands at the heart of Europe. This linguistic diversity is a direct reflection of Germany's complex and fragmented past. Unlike nations like France or Britain, which consolidated their identities and borders relatively early, the land we now call Germany remained a patchwork of duchies, kingdoms, and free cities for centuries. There was no single, unified Germany to name. Instead, neighboring peoples named the region after the first tribe they happened to encounter on their shared border. It's a geographical Rorschach test. What you call it depends entirely on where you stand and who you met first. The answer to our question, therefore, isn't a simple one. It's a journey into the heart of European history itself. The core of the mystery lies in the disconnect between the endonym, what the people of a country call it themselves, and the exonyms, the names used by outsiders. For Germans, their home is Deutschland, a name deeply rooted in their own language and cultural evolution. But for much of the world, the country is known by a name given to it by its ancient adversaries, the Romans. This linguistic ghost has haunted the maps of Europe for more than 2,000 years, a testament to the incredible staying power of a name, even one born from a simple and perhaps convenient mistake made on a hostile frontier long, long ago. So, let's peel back the layers of this historical onion. We will travel back to the dense forests of ancient Europe, where Roman legions faced off against fierce warriors they barely understood. We will explore the evolution of languages, the rise and fall of empires, and the very idea of what it means to be a nation. The story of why we call Germany Germany is more than just a piece of trivia. It's a powerful illustration of how history is not just written by the victors, but also by the namers. The labels they create can echo through the ages, shaping our perception of the world long after their empires have turned to dust. Our story begins on the banks of the mighty Rhine River around 58 BC. This was the edge of the known world for the Roman Republic, a formidable natural barrier separating the ordered civilized lands of Gaul from the wild, unknown territories to the east. It was here that the ambitious Roman general Julius Caesar was campaigning, pushing the boundaries of Roman influence ever northward. As he documented his conquests in his famous work, Commentaria de Bello Gallico, or Commentaries on the Gallic War, he needed a term to describe the disparate, non-Gaulish peoples living across the river. He chose the name Germani. Where did Caesar get this name? The origins are murky, a subject of intense debate among historians and linguists to this day. One prominent theory suggests that Germany was not a name these tribes used for themselves. Instead, it may have been a term used by the Gauls to describe their eastern neighbors. It could have meant something as simple as neighbor, or perhaps something more descriptive like men of the forest or even the noisy ones, referring to their fearsome war cries. Caesar, a pragmatic military man rather than an ethnographer, likely picked up the term from his Gallic allies and applied it as a convenient catch-all label for everyone living in this vast, mysterious land. Crucially, the land Caesar called Germania was not a country. It had no central government, no shared capital, and no unified identity. It was a geographical concept, a line drawn on a Roman map to delineate the border of their world. To the Romans, everything east of the Rhine and north of the Danube was Germania, a sprawling expanse of dense forests, treacherous swamps, and fiercely independent tribes. This act of naming was an act of simplification, a way for the Roman military and administrative mind to make sense of a complex and threatening reality. They weren't naming a people, they were labeling an area and its inhabitants for their own strategic purposes. This Roman label, born of military expediency, would have profound and lasting consequences. By grouping dozens of distinct tribal cultures under a single name, the Romans inadvertently created an identity, at least in the eyes of the outside world. They forged the first faint outline of a concept that would one day become Germany. The name Germani began to appear in official Roman records, on maps, and in the writings of historians like Tacitus, whose famous work Germania provided a detailed, if romanticized, account of these tribes. The name stuck, cementing a Roman misunderstanding into the bedrock of Western consciousness for centuries to come. So who were these people the Romans collectively branded as the Germani? They were certainly not a single unified ethnic group. The lands of Germania were home to a vibrant and shifting mosaic of dozens, if not hundreds of distinct tribes, each with its own customs, dialect and leadership. These groups often fought amongst themselves as fiercely as they fought against the Romans. To suggest they shared a common German identity in the modern sense would be an anachronism. They were Cherusci, Chatti, Marcomanni, Suebi, Frisi, and many others. Their primary loyalty was to their clan, their chieftain, and their immediate tribal confederation, not to some vague, overarching concept of being German. Among the most famous of these tribes were the Teutons, whose migrations in the late 2nd century BC brought them into a bloody conflict with the Roman Republic, creating an early Roman awareness of the peoples from beyond the Alps. Later, other groups like the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes would leave their continental homelands to migrate to Britain, fundamentally shaping the future of the English language and nation. The Franks, another powerful Germanic confederation, would go on to conquer Gaul and establish the Carolingian Empire, the precursor to both modern France and Germany. Each tribe had its own destiny, its own story. The Roman decision to lump them all together under the label Germani was a classic example of imperial categorization. It served to create a clear other, a barbarian counterpart to the civilized Roman world. In his writings, the historian Tacitus both admired their perceived virtues, bravery, loyalty, and simplicity, and feared their ferocity and love of freedom. This portrayal, while influential, was still an outsider's perspective. It flattened the diverse realities of tribal life into a single, romanticized, and often contradictory image. The people living in these lands would not have recognized themselves in this portrait. They were simply living their lives, unaware they were being cast as a single character in Rome's grand historical drama. This act of external naming had a strange long-term effect. While these tribes had no shared identity at the time, the constant pressure from the Roman Empire and the shared experience of being labeled Germani may have, over many centuries, contributed to the very sense of commonality it initially misrepresented. The shared enemy and the shared name imposed from the outside slowly began to foster connections and alliances between disparate groups. The Roman mistake, in a way, began a long and winding process that would eventually lead to the very unity the Romans had incorrectly assumed existed from the beginning. It was a prophecy that, over 1,000 years, would help fulfill itself. While the Romans and their successors in Western Europe continued to use variations of Germania, a different word was taking root among the Germanic-speaking peoples themselves. This word was Deutsch. Its origin lies not in a place name or a tribal name, but in the language of the people. It evolved from the Old High German word Deutsch, which itself came from the Proto-Germanic Theudiskas. This ancient term simply meant of the people or belonging to the people. It was a word used to distinguish the common vernacular language of the Germanic tribes from the scholarly and ecclesiastical Latin used by the clergy and the Frankish nobility. Initially, Deutsch was purely a linguistic term. When a scholar or a cleric in the 8th or 9th century referred to Theodiscus, the Latinized form, they were talking about the popular tongue, the language spoken by the ordinary folk, as opposed to Latin. It was a way of saying the language of our people. This was a crucial development. For the first time, there was a word that united the various Germanic-speaking tribes, the Saxons, the Bavarians, the Swabians, the Franks, not by a name given to them by outsiders, but by the shared reality of the language they spoke. It was an identity forged from the ground up, from the very words they used every day. Over time, the meaning of Deutsch expanded. From signifying the language of the people, it began to refer to the people themselves, and eventually, to the lands they inhabited. By the 10th century, the term Regnum Teutonicum, or Kingdom of the Germans, began to appear in Latin texts to describe the eastern part of the former Carolingian Empire. This kingdom was the precursor to the Holy Roman Empire. The people living within this realm increasingly referred to their lands as Deutsch land, which would, over the following centuries, evolve and standardize into the modern German word Deutschland, literally, the people's land. This parallel development is the key to our puzzle. As the concept of a German-speaking kingdom began to solidify in the Middle Ages, the people within it adopted a name for themselves and their country that was born from their own language, Deutschland. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe, whose linguistic and political traditions were inherited from Rome, continued to use the old Roman label. The English, French, and Italians kept calling the region Germany or Allemagne, names based on ancient tribes or Roman geographical terms. The two naming traditions, one internal, one external, began to run on separate tracks, a divergence that continues to this very day. The political idea of Germany began to take a more concrete, albeit incredibly complex shape with the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. Established in the 10th century from the eastern remnants of Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire, this entity was a sprawling, decentralized patchwork of territories. It was officially the Holy Roman Empire, but from the 15th century onwards, it was often called the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. This addition was significant. It marked a growing recognition that the empire's core territories were predominantly German-speaking lands, distinguishing it from its Italian and Burgundian components. The idea of a German political space was slowly emerging from the medieval fog. Despite this emerging identity, the Holy Roman Empire was never a nation-state in the modern sense. It was a loose confederation of hundreds of semi-independent states, duchies, principalities, and free cities, all under the nominal authority of an elected emperor. A resident of Cologne would have seen themselves as a colonier first, a subject of the empire second, and perhaps a German in a vague cultural sense third. This fragmentation meant that while the inhabitants were increasingly linked by a shared language, Deutsch, and a shared imperial framework, a strong unified national identity was still centuries away. This internal complexity made it easy for outsiders to continue relying on their old, simpler labels. For neighboring countries like France and England, the intricate internal politics of the Holy Roman Empire were largely irrelevant to the process of naming. They continued to use the familiar exonyms passed down through generations. To the French, the lands across the Rhine were the home of the Alemanni tribe they had first encountered, hence Allemagne. For the English and others who inherited the Roman tradition, the region remained Germany, the land of the Germani described by Caesar and Tacitus. The name Deutschland was an internal affair, a term used by the Germans themselves, but it failed to penetrate the linguistic habits of their neighbors. This period cemented the great divergence in naming. Inside the empire, the concept of Deutschland grew stronger, nurtured by a shared language, the printing press, which standardized High German through works like the Luther Bible, and a growing body of German literature and music. Yet on the outside, the old Roman name remained stubbornly fixed. The political disunity of the Holy Roman Empire prevented it from projecting a single official name onto the international stage with the same force as more centralized kingdoms like France or Spain. The Roman mistake, made 1,000 years prior, continued to define Germany for the rest of the world. The persistence of these different names into the modern era is, well, a living museum of European history. Each name tells a different story of contact and perception. The most common family of names used in English, Italian, Germania, and many other languages stems directly from the Latin Germania. This is the legacy of the Roman Empire's intellectual and cultural dominance over Western Europe. When these languages needed a word for the country, they reached back to the classical texts of Caesar and Tacitus, adopting the name the Romans had used. It's a clear case of historical inheritance where the pen of a Roman general proved mightier than the tongue of the people he was describing. A second major group of names, including the French Allemagne, the Spanish Alemania, and the Portuguese Alemana, comes from the Alemanni. The Alemanni were a confederation of Germanic tribes who lived along the upper Rhine River, in what is now Alsace, Switzerland, and Baden-Württemberg. They were the Germanic people that the Franks, the predecessors of the modern French, had the most direct and sustained contact with. As is often the case, the name of the part came to stand for the whole. For the French and by extension the Spanish and Portuguese, Germany became the land of the Alemanni, the first Germans they got to know. A third, quite different category of names is found in some of Germany's eastern neighbors. In Polish the country is called Niemcy, and in Czech it's Nemeko. These names are thought to derive from a Slavic root, nemi, which means mute or one who cannot speak. This was likely a term early Slavic peoples used to describe their Germanic neighbors, whose language they could not understand. It's a fascinating insight into early cultural encounters. The strangers next door were simply the mutes, the people who spoke an incomprehensible tongue. Here the name is not based on a tribe or a Roman label but on a linguistic barrier. Finally, we see another pattern in Finland and Estonia, where Germany is known as Saksa and Saksamaa, respectively. These names originate from the Saxons, another powerful Germanic tribe that inhabited the northern coastal regions of Germany. The seafaring peoples of the Baltic, including the ancestors of the Finns and Estonians, primarily encountered Germans through the trading and raiding activities of the Saxons. Consequently, they named the entire land after the specific tribe they dealt with most frequently. Each of these naming conventions, Germania, Alemanni, Niemcy, Saksa, is a fossilized first impression, a linguistic snapshot of a historical moment of contact. One might wonder why, after Germany finally unified into a single nation-state in 1871, the world didn't simply adopt its official name, Deutschland. By this point, the country had a strong central government and a clear national identity. Yet the old names held fast. The primary reason is linguistic inertia. Names for other countries are deeply embedded in a language's vocabulary and culture. They are learned by children, used in newspapers, printed on maps, and spoken in government halls. Changing the established name for a major country like Germany would be an immense and honestly impractical undertaking. Kind of like asking English speakers to suddenly start calling Spain España or Japan Nippon in everyday conversation. Furthermore, the name Germany had, by the 19th century, accumulated over 1,800 years of history and meaning within the English language itself. It was the name used by Shakespeare, by Gibbon, and by every English-speaking historian, politician, and traveler who had ever referred to the region. It had become an English word in its own right, detached from its Latin origins, and carrying its own set of cultural and historical associations. To replace it with Deutschland would be to sever a long-standing linguistic tradition. The name had become part of the fabric of the English language, and fabrics once woven are not easily unpicked. The German government itself has never made a significant push for other countries to adopt Deutschland. Many nations have successfully campaigned to change their international names, such as when Persia became Iran or when Burma became Myanmar. However, Germany has generally accepted the world's diverse naming conventions. This might be due to a pragmatic understanding of linguistic reality, or perhaps because the existence of multiple names reflects the country's central and historically complex role in Europe. The German people are well aware of the different names for their homeland, and the topic is a common point of conversation with foreigners, often met with bemused explanation rather than frustration. Ultimately, the name Germany persists because it works. It unambiguously refers to the correct country, and its meaning is universally understood among English speakers. While it may be historically inaccurate from a German perspective, its function as a clear and consistent identifier in international communication is undeniable. Language is a practical tool as much as it is a cultural artifact. The Roman label, born from a need to simplify a complex world, continues to serve that same function for English speakers today. It may be a mistake, but it's a mistake that has proven remarkably useful and resilient over the centuries. And so, we arrive back at our original question. The reason English speakers say Germany while Germans say Deutschland is a story of two parallel histories. It is the tale of a name imposed from the outside by a Roman general, and a name that grew organically from within, from the very language of the people. Julius Caesar, in his quest to conquer Gaul and define the borders of the Roman world, made a simple classification. He took a local, perhaps Gaulish word, and applied it as a blanket term for the myriad tribes east of the Rhine. It was a military and administrative shortcut, a way of labeling the other on the far side of the river. This act of naming, a seemingly minor detail in a grand campaign, set in motion a linguistic tradition that would outlast the Roman Empire itself. The name Germania was codified by Roman writers, copied by medieval monks, and eventually inherited by the languages that grew out of Latin's shadow, including English. It became the default exonym, the standard international term, for a region that, for most of its history, had no single identity of its own. The name stuck not because it was accurate, but because it was ancient, established, and came from the most prestigious cultural and political power in Western history. Meanwhile, the people living in those lands embarked on their own journey of self-discovery. They found unity not in a Roman label, but in the common tongue they spoke, the language they called Deutsch. This word, meaning of the people, became the foundation of their identity, evolving into Deutschland, the people's land. The creation of Deutschland was an internal process, a slow awakening of cultural and eventually political unity that spanned a millennium. But by the time this identity was fully formed, the outside world had already been calling their home Germany for nearly 2,000 years. The name of a country is like a portrait, painted by many hands over many centuries. The portrait of Germany that we see in the English language was first sketched by a Roman general's mistake. It's a powerful reminder that history is a messy, complicated business, and that the words we use every day are often echoes of ancient events and long-forgotten empires. A simple name holds within it a sprawling story of conquest, culture, and the enduring power of a single fateful misunderstanding. Subscribe for more mind-blowing stories behind country names, and drop a comment: which nation should we decode next?